touch the microphone. Welcome all to the Spitzer Spring 2023 lecture series. And for those of you online who may not know me, my name is Marta Gutman, and I'm the Dean of the Spitzer School of Architecture, and delighted to welcome you to our lecture series today, the second lecture in our series across the Pacific Rim, Architecture and Landscape in Translation. So as is our wont, we'll begin with this acknowledgement that the Spitzer School of Architecture, grounded on the schist bedrock outcrop of Harlem, is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Munsee Lenape, Wappinger, and Wecquaesgeek peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obliged to know the histories of dispossession that have allowed this college to grow and thrive on a vibrant terrain. And as designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantling the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. And after having made that acknowledgement, I would like to also acknowledge that the Sciame Lecture Series is made possible by the Spitzer Architecture Fund and the generous support of one of our alums, Frank Sciame, CEO of Sciame Construction. So in just a minute, I'll ask our dear colleague, Professor Zhang. It's been a long day. Professor Jerome Hayford to introduce our speakers. But I would just say that it is really my great pleasure to welcome Lizzie and Christine here. Christine was my student one time ago, and it's wonderful to see how she's flourished and grown and developed into quite an amazing landscape architect. She's also a faculty alum, having taught in our landscape architecture program. So tonight, they'll be giving a lecture here labeled Translations, and I have the correct pronunciations written out for me. Wǒmen, day stories, song practice, pedagogy, and Dao organizing. So please join me in welcoming these and Christine and then Jerome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out this evening to celebrate and share knowledge with these two amazing individuals. It is my pleasure to briefly introduce Christin and Bees, and an additional pleasure to introduce two people who are collaborators of mine as part of Dark Matter U. And so I have the special privilege not only to introduce you now in this space, but also to have been able to work with these two amazing individuals. So I'm glad that to see people out to see what they have to share with us today. And so, you know, they're intersecting the Spitzer as part of our lecture series, but it's been great to intersect through a different cross-section with you two as part of the EMU, and to witness your theory and your practice in that context. And so I don't think I have to really set up this talk. I think they're going to set it up a little bit for us when they begin. So I'll just give a little bit more sort of preamble. And you know, really it's been great to sort of witness their theory and their practice within a kind of transformative pedagogical space, which I would consider this school also a transformative pedagogical space. So it's really great to sort of have you here in those different contexts, and this ongoing transformative moment that we find ourselves within, if we think of sort of 2020, 2015, forever as a kind of ongoing transformative moment that I think you two are operating within. And Christin, of course, is also an alumni of the school. So a great shout out again to bringing an alumni here to speak. And, you know, and Bees has sort of worked in parallel with some of the efforts of the school with DMU as part of the Lisbon Triennale, which I know several folks in the Spitzer community, including myself, were part of. Both Bees and Christin helped to work on the exhibition at the Lisbon Triennale for the dark matter constellation exhibit, which we have the support of students who I see in this room in achieving that. So, I think it's all of this is to say that there are kind of these many webs of relationship and collaboration that exist and that kind of come to bear in these sort of academic contexts. And so dare I say, another constellation that we're going to see tonight. So I'm going to quickly read their bios. So Christin Hu, Guilin, Guilin, Guangxi, Guilin.
Yep.
Okay. And Hefei Anhui is a designer and coordinator from Lenapehoking, New York. Through accessible games for collaborative design, critical learning methods, and facilitated workshops, they help others build genuine relationships with one another and our shared environments. Christin currently works as a visiting assistant professor at Pratt Institute of Architecture, and organizes within the Design as Protest Collaborative. I meant to mention that collective as well, and Dark Matter U, and supports local food justice efforts. They hold an MLA from Harvard GSD and a BArch from our own Spitzer City College Spitzer School of Architecture. Woohoo! Yay! Bees Zhang, Zhangdi, I'm sorry, I'm not
You're good.
doing great. Is an architect, artist, organizer, and educator from Lenapehoking, New York, Anhui and Shandong, currently based in Hovangar, otherwise known as LA. They are a co-organizer with Design as Protest Collective, or otherwise known as DAP, and Dark Matter U, otherwise known as DMU, and a project manager with the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, and a licensed architect in California. Their design and research practice wonders aloud about the representations of violence and the violence of representations by asking questions both using and about disciplinary tools for art and architecture. Bees holds degrees from the University of California, Berkeley and Brown University.
Thank you. Thank you, Zihao, Marta, for the invitation. Thank you, Jerome, for the lovely introduction. Thank you, Nicholas and Camille, wherever you are, for the generous coordination. Asno Hassan for helping us out just now. And thank you, everybody in the room who's here sharing time and space with us today. Can you hear us okay? Awesome. A note to start, Chinglish is what's called an interlanguage, which means that unlike dialects, vernaculars, and pidgins, it doesn't necessarily carry over discernible rules from one speaker to the next. Rather, what's reflected are the idiosyncrasies of each individual speaker based on what language they learned first and which one they learn next. For instance, in my immediate family, my parents, my sibling, and I share specific preferences for which words we typically say in English or Mandarin, and this may differ for Christin and for you. And in speaking from any diaspora, although in this case, the Sino or Chinese diaspora, there are as many experiences as there are people. For instance, Christin and I will be speaking Mandarin and using simplified characters from our lived experience, which does not begin to represent the linguistic, written, and spoken diversity of the Sino diaspora as a whole, which includes spoken Cantonese, Hokkien, Taiwanese, Hakka, Khoisan, Shanghainese, and Tuhua, or regional dialects across the Pacific and Asia, as well as written scripts from traditional characters to Nushu, created by and for women in Hunan, and Xiaojing, which are Sinitic languages written in Persian and Arabic script. And so it felt fitting for us to speak from a deeply personal and individual, yet broadly shared and collective interlanguage, that is Chinglish, for our talk translations, Women to Stories, Tong, Practice Pedagogy, Organizing. And speaking of moving from the individual to collective, and the two of us coming together to co-author a lecture, we began by looking for where the intersections exist in our distinct models of practice.
So our work together actually began after a Zoom call with Brian Lee Jr. following the Design as Protest national call in 2020. So we had approached that, or I had actually approached that from the kind of point of view of failed architecture. I had been editing for this media platform known as Failed Architecture, and we were putting together a spreadsheet after, I don't know if you all remember that were the black squares, everyone posting all these things. And so we were documenting this in the spreadsheet. And so that's kind of like how I approached Brian and be like, hey, let's collaborate. And these came from the point of view of putting together that great anti-racist design resources Google Doc, which you all may have known about as well, which later became the DAP Weekly Roundup. So this, as we kind of move together tonight, we'd like to share some of our individual and collective stories, offering students models of practice that embody translation in our work as designers, organizers, and educators in architecture and the landscape architecture fields. Ultimately, our aim is to use these stories of diasporic practices of translation to form the conversation to follow this lecture. And that way we can kind of explore more ideas about future models of practice, pedagogy, and organizing. So get comfy, stretch a little, we're gonna basically trade some stories back and forth as we move forward today.
Awesome, thank you. So as a Chinese diasporic person whose family lives on both sides of the Pacific Ocean, in mainland China as well as in the continental US, and as a practitioner trained first in Western art and secondly in Western architecture, much of how I approach my work tends to converge in one particular painting. This painting, this scroll painting, over 5 meters long by 11th century artist Zhang, and it's titled Qingming Tu, or Along the River During the Qingming Festival, painted nearly 1,000 years ago. And now my attempt to show you the extent of the work, again over 5 meters, of course results in us not really being able to see it at all, and that's precisely the point. Scroll paintings were in fact choreographed to be unveilings, unravelings of a spatial temporal narrative in which the viewer has to move around the work, shifting their view itself rather than moving in front of a view that's already fixed. And so in words more familiar to those of us with landscape and architectural training, parallel projection allowed Zhang Zedong in the 11th century and other East Asian artists to create expansive, sweeping visual and spatial analyses of class, gender, geography, and daily life with great precision. As well, in East Asian painting traditions, text was often incorporated as poetry to heighten the experience. In this case, the title suggesting a long journey upriver home to care for the tombs of ancestors. All of these sweeping translations of landscape into meaning, I was taught this by my Chinese diasporic family, but not so curiously, neither in art school nor architecture school in the US. So I was also never taught the Mandarin for parallel projection, 点句透视, but a term more familiar to me is 宇宙, meaning universe, as in 宇宙的奥秘, mysteries of the universe. But taken apart, the two words by themselves mean respectively space and time. Because in traditional Chinese cosmology, dating to 2,000 years ago and beyond, the universe has always been simply space-time as a continuum. And as other scholars have detailed, this cosmology and the representational tool parallel projection emerged contemporaneously, informed one another greatly, and certainly might explain to us today why humans in the 1st century might have thought this was a fun way to draw. And the dissonance arises then from a moment when scholars estimate 16th or 17th century Jesuit missionaries brought parallel projection from the east to the west, along with silk, tea, gunpowder, paper, and spice. And as historian Lisa Lowe has described, this imperial and colonial encounter itself was deeply and intimately connected to and spurred the same imperial and colonial encounters across the Atlantic. in search of another route to India, to China, to gold, glory, and ultimately ending in the expropriation of indigenous and African sovereignties. Only to be finally documented in writing by William Farish, who writes in 1822 on isometrical perspective, why this representational tool might be useful to industrializing Britain, as well as claiming authorship without mention of any significance of parallel projection elsewhere, cultural or cosmological. So a drawing as cosmology becomes displaced over space and time into a tool for describing machines in service of capital. This isn't to romanticize or flatten the origins of parallel projection, but to, in this moment, give a little breathing room in this space to the scale of how many diasporic translations of ideas have nestled up atop one another in our bodies and in this room.
Speaking of the scale of diasporic translation, as when I was studying here at City College, which was not that long ago, I was taking a survey of world architecture 4 with Professor now Dean Gutman. And as a part of that class, I actually started writing, I wrote this history of where we live, right? It was about kind of like, I think it was called the house history paper. I don't know if that's still in science, but maybe. So this scale of the sort of domestic scale of diasporic translation really was the first time I started looking at the architectural history of like how I lived and how my mom's family also lived, because they came over, my parents came over under very particular economic and political circumstances post-Cultural Revolution, and also after the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965, as well as the US recognition of the People's Republic of China in 1978. Many of us from diasporas begin practicing translation early in life, navigating multiple verbal and body languages, conflicting cultural values, and even creating new languages like Chinglish. I personally didn't have to do much language translation when I was a child because my mom actually started learning English when she was in China. But we did have to do quite a bit of spatial translation in the sense of us being a family of 3, me, my mom, and my brother, and navigating the domestic space of a New York City condo, and trying to kind of like create a sense of home. So instead, this kind of became, well, what you could say, wǒmen, the 家庭, the space, 家庭 or space of the home or domestic space. In Chinese, the character for home, or where someone physically resides, is also used to describe family, but family also implies in both the US and in China a nuclear family. And so us, a family of 3, as we began living in this sort of these 1-bedroom apartments designed for single young professionals, we decided to, well, sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. We basically had to translate and move around the furniture and navigate these hallways of these to kind of create a better sense of home. So this is a plan from basically a layout of how we lived, and the different actions and where they took place. We had these 2 1-bedroom apartments, and they were on different floors, completely on the opposite sides of the space. When we were living there as kids, not many people were in the hallways, so we just ran around barefoot, like kind of treating it as like another extended space of our home. We even created another, like we even generate a different kind of activity, our own kind of activity, which was to roast butt or shawl people. And this was because there's actually a very conveniently located, centrally located radiator, right in that kind of 8-foot or something by 8-foot space there. And so when, it was just big enough so that my mom and my brother and me could sit on it on a cold night. And we would just sort of sit there after dinner, chatting and, kind of just like hanging out until it was time for us to go to bed or 楼下, which is downstairs. As the years went by and my brother moved out, changes took place more incrementally in the form of furniture arrangement. So this is actually an exact excerpt from the House Histories paper that I submitted, which shows the different furniture layouts of the same space. It's funny because in the paper I was rereading, I mentioned how my mom, how I would actually joke about how my mom made so many frequent furniture, changes and how this kind of like, it seemed very sudden all the time. But my mom actually thought really carefully about this every single time. And it was really to accommodate different sleeping situations. Like, for example, my brother moving out. So now we transformed this into a study. It was a way for us to kind of, well, for her to really take control of that space as well, as someone who's immigrated to this country. And so there was, for the most part, never a need to draw up any of plans of this. It was just done, right? Like, as long as my mom could move it by herself, we were moving it, we do have to perform some kind of accurate survey of this apartment. And, as architects, right, there's floor plans can go down to the specificity of a 16th of an inch. Well, from the context of our home, I was wondering about the ability about the space to shape, how the ability of the way of shaping the space. For example, my mom being able to lift a piece of furniture actually tells more about the accuracy of a particular design. So is a drawing, I began to wonder basically, is a drawing still accurate if the person who lives there can't actually build it or can't actually make it happen? This is just something that I've been pondering, especially in architectural drawings, as we discuss as designers putting something on a paper, but also how are you going to build it, right? Thinking about the practicality of this. So anyways, it doesn't, is it still accurate really, even if we still fit it in somehow? Or in Chinese, we would say, yeah, we can still find it out. So more about accuracy and precision here. They're often used interchangeably, but there is a slight difference, which you may remember from science in high school or something like that. But while accuracy refers to how close a value is to the truth or reality, precision is how close values are to one another, or how reliably a given set of actions produces consistent results. In Chinese, 准, or meaning standard or exact, 确, authentic and true, and 信, 准确信, is the nature of quality, or and 精确 is more of a kind of refined, a sense of refinement. So both have aspects of truth, but the accuracy includes an idea of closest to what is natural, and precision almost implies a kind of subset of the truth. This is a kind of refinement of that truth. So the next story about how I encountered accuracy and precision in my work and what can be said about the truths in architectural drawings is kind of a reflection of some of the drawings that I did as a landscape designer. While I was working in these firms, I came across something called the site layout plan. This is just an example, but it's not from a particular project. But I was kind of struck by the carefulness with which dimensions were given and provided, right? It's not in a construction document, you don't always put every single dimension. There's always an order to where you put them, where you start from that dimension. And you get measurements for accuracy, like verification points, right? Maybe I can point to this. Verification points or benchmarks, right? Those need to be extremely accurate because they're referring to very important infrastructural like the place of water main or something like that. But other kinds of dimensions that over here are like, have like clear, or like a minimum or maximum, or like, on center, right? These are kind of more about the precision of a particular kind of proportion. So the careful omission and placement of dimensions reflect an order of building as well as a priority of design elements. The most important being the placement of the water fountain over here due to the need of that infrastructure. So in terms of the order itself, right, it looks like, oh, 001, we have the benchmark and 001. So it's telling us, this drawing is telling us to start here. Locate this first, and then you can base all other things off of it. So I wonder about the practicality of this site layout plan and its relationship to the actual building of the design. Who's doing this, right? What do you actually need in order to build this? What is this drawing assuming? First of all, we know that this person definitely has to have a measuring tape, right? How are they going to know what that distance is? Then they need to have some kind of string line or straight edge, not unlike a tool that you would need for drawing, right? To document this kind of like baseline or straight line here. Then all these kind of coordinates that are given require GPS or theodolite or something that kind of can locate these GPS coordinates and these individual points and angles. And so there are a lot of assumptions about what a contractor has, or who can actually execute the site layout plan. And these concerns, of course, extend beyond the site layout plan, like including in materials and details, and how, specifications, things like that. But in here, I always wonder and think back to actually one of the studios I had at City College, which is where we actually learned how to measure things in other ways, right? So what happens when we start to think about measurement in different kinds of capacities, where it's like, oh yeah, maybe it's 10 paces away, or maybe use I remember one of my professors, I think it was Professor Timothy Collins, who's like, oh yeah, your forearm is about a foot or something, use that to measure it, and what does this start to tell us about what's important to consider in a drawing, right? Does this now become the most precise way of building, where you are actually considering, oh, okay, a person in a wheelchair needs this amount of space next between the bench and the water fountain, and then what kinds of other diverse types of knowledge can be integrated in the design process and the building process when you say, okay, yeah, one tree. Well, what kind of tree, right? Who needs to know, or who has that knowledge of how much space a tree needs? So this kind of starts to talk about, what are ways architects and designers can consider other points of view and the means for which to reach a certain degree of accuracy in that design. Okay, yes. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. All right, we're gonna zoom back out now to the Pacific Rim of California. Come with me. And I have sort of at this point gone rogue. I started making my own drawings, crude representations, if you will, of oil landscapes, because in researching sites of extraction and resistance, starting with my own Master of Architecture thesis, I regularly found that most existing documents, architectural and otherwise, are neither accurate nor precise about adjacencies, and thus could not become accurate or precise about their impacts. When oil infrastructures are adjacent to our homes and communities, as they always are at some scale, these documents tend to not include both places at once, or to otherwise misrepresent spatial violence. So here, an image search for Point Melody Beach in Richmond, California, and the adjacent Chevron refinery, yield photo narratives of place that seem worlds apart, and yet these two places are only imagined as separate and are really one petrochemical landscape. And as Richmond residents fighting environmental injustice can attest, This is a harrowing and dangerous oversight with extreme harms done to communities and ecosystems. So I made my own landscape translation of reality in the form of an acrylic painting at an architectural scale, 1 inch to 250 feet, in a projection that comes from both Chinese painting and Western architecture, which, if it sounds a bit convoluted, imagine how I feel inside. And insofar as acrylic is actually a petroleum product, I would say this is in fact an oil painting. I could make this painting by translating, they've got jokes. I could make this painting by translating 2D and 3D data integrated from publicly available sources like OpenStreetMap for roads and political boundaries, NASA and the US Geological Survey for topography and so forth. These tools that we use as architects and landscape architects can approximate real-world spatial conditions with pretty remarkable precision. So we can see buildings and freeways and railways and the contours of the land and the line work. However, this precision is only as good as the data we put in. And whereas publicly available sources that I mentioned may attempt to give us the reality of built structures, they leave out things like oil infrastructures, seen in the satellite imagery and conspicuously absent in the line work, which turns out to not be so accurate at all. Today, this is usually how we as a public would see sites of extraction, like petrochemical infrastructure. And this bird's eye view, which itself has roots as a military technology, distorts our relationship to it. There are almost no publicly available images of these places that might help us understand how they work and what the types of spatial violence, toxic pollution and contamination, environmental disasters, and so forth that they may be inflicting. This refinery in Richmond in particular is notorious for toxic gas flares, spills in the bay as recently as last year, and even explosions. We think of architectural line work or satellite imagery as more technologically advanced and thus more accurate, while we assume paintings, and landscape paintings in particular, are not, perhaps. But it's unclear from this municipal zoning map with which the city of Richmond determines lawful land use, whether something huge has been missed in the accuracy of its visual representation. And not all maps are tools of extractive settler colonialism, but this most early USGS map of Richmond in 1895 certainly was, designating place names based on Western ideologies of private property, as well as Spanish settler rancho systems, which, by the way, as an aside, the rancho systems were designated literally in drawings called diseños, designs. We can see that what was once wetland ecosystems in relation to Ohlone communities is today an infilled network of pipes, railways, tanks, boilers, and tailing ponds. And on the edge of this 1915 geological survey, we see that Point Melody was actually the site of a Chinese shrimping village in the center left. Point to it there. One of dozens that were found across the San Francisco Bay Area, from Richmond to Oakland to Marin to Hunters Point, only one of which is preserved today. And at this point, having been founded in 1902, we can already see Standard Oils here, so there, from which Chevron still today receives oil tankers. Contrasting that with the most recently publicly available USGS map of Richmond from 2021, which uses the same pale blue code, pale blue fill, to code for the toxic tailing ponds in the refinery yard at the top of the image, as well as the East Bay water on the bottom, and omits any other markings that would indicate the presence of oil. But most of us are not looking at maps made by the US Geological Survey. We're looking at one particular map made by Google, which employs the same spatial logic. Just as freeways are flattened to approximate surface roads, which softens our perception of their violent past and present, oil infrastructures melt into soft grays and blues, as if they weren't even there. And this strategy of obscuring complex systems is by design, such that we, the public, can't properly see, understand, and thus question and dismantle with accuracy and precision. At the core and contractually, what architects do is to create documents using architectural language to facilitate transitions between past, present, and future. These documents play an outsized role not only in construction and how we construct, but in historical and legal records and in our shared understandings of place. It is both powerful and dangerous to make them. We reproduce systems of oppression by stabilizing them through documents claiming neutrality, through omissions, through complicitness, through carelessness. But tools come from many spacetimes and can be used in many other ways. So, from accuracy and precision, our next stories concern intent, literally a tool, a drawing or a map of yi, meaning and desire, and impact, 影响, as the composite of a shadow thrown, ying, and a sound carried, xiang. What shadows and sounds are cast out, thrown out by the maps of our desires? And what is our responsibility to each other in and outside of our disciplines? So, shout out Jerome on this slide. As part of Dark Matter, NAL, who is in the room too. Multiple, many. As part of Dark Matter U, a collective of anti-racist design practitioners and educators, Christin and I both participated, along with AL, Jerome, and others, in the development of DMU's co-authored and co-facilitated design seminar, Foundations of Design Justice, which has been taught across 5 schools, across undergraduate and graduate levels, and in a community partnership in New York over the past 3 years. The course presents alternative models of design practice within the course content, but it also attempts to model alternative ways of teaching and learning together. And this is what our students typically cite as most transformative. Rather than elevating one singular expert in the room, each course has at least 2 DMU co-facilitators in each session, dozens of co-authors, a critical mass of 1 or more design justice guest lecturer in each week, and supporting partners in and outside the university. There are a lot of DMU projects we could talk about tonight, but Christin and I wanted to highlight this one because it embodies so much of DMU's intent and impact, while also provoking important ongoing questions about how our intent is translated into impact. One of the strengths of the Foundations course is our collective course development process, which directly embodies our mission to create new forms of knowledge production, collectivity, and community. So the course development for EquiDJ began in the summer of 2020 with a lifetime ago, with non-hierarchical brainstorming sessions that drew upon our network's lived experiences, professional expertise, and academic insights. Then in the fall of 2020, we coordinated university partnerships. We staffed the courses with co-facilitators and guest lecturers. And we had a focus group of several dozen co-authors who pushed through months of Sunday meetings, long but joyous, to organize themes, subject areas, and learning goals into the resulting syllabus. Now, each semester's syllabus itself then continues to be collectively developed as a live document that is regularly coordinated between the co-facilitators and the students across the schools, as well as supplemented with resources from all involved, so living on the drive. And from the educator side, as each DMU co-facilitator comes from a different community and oftentimes diasporas, Foundations of Design Justice is actually never going to be the same course twice, and it shouldn't be, because each pair of co-facilitators co-translates the syllabus as a tool according to their overlapping lived experiences. However, core goals, vision, and intent are not always so directly translatable into impact. At the scale of the classroom, we recognize that our students experience different forms of vulnerability as a result of differing positionalities to each other and to us. An enlightening moment for some students with access to systemic privileges may be burdensome or even harmful to students without that access, or to the co-facilitators even. We are continuing then to ask ourselves what the benefits and detriments are, and there are both, for students in a design justice course to be in shared spaces of varying racialized, gendered, classed, abled, or disabled experience, for students to be in cross-institutional spaces, in virtual or hybrid spaces, in non-punitive grade structures, and to be frank, in elective courses that are at this point not NAB accredited, and thus cannot always be funded. And while we and our students, and perhaps us in the room, may see anti-racism and collectivity as inherently part of design practice and pedagogy, we and our students both face institutional barriers to expanding the reach of this class. What's critical is that we continue to push forward. Collective work may require a slower pace or funding that is not, schools cannot or will not sometimes find, but collective work also creates stronger networks, stronger support systems, and stronger continuities across institutions and across academic years, right? And in translating this course from Florida A&M to University of Buffalo to Utah and UMich and Drexel and Van Alen's Gowanus Neighborhood Fellowship, which AL worked on here in New York, both intent and impact and the questions raised by both are amplified across time and space, deepening and broadening with each added perspective.
So some of you may have seen this already, but zooming out from the classroom to the architecture and design field as a whole, I'd like to share a bit about the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index, which you may have seen. I'm going to be referring to the index for short, but part of the reason why I joined the DAP Collective was to help develop the index, which is a living tool for design practitioners, organizers, local governments, and the academic institutions. It's about a series of actions that help follow up and carry out the sort of impact of the statements that institutions have made. So for those of you who don't know, the DAP Collective is a group of anti-racist designers who were brought together by the Design Justice Demands and National Call in 2020, organized in solidarity with the movement for Black Lives. There's a richer history which you can read about in the You Are Anti-Racist newspaper, and I brought some with me if any students want some after the lecture. So my role in co-developing this, which it was very much a collective process, but my role in co-developing the index was collecting and then translating all of these collective experiences and anti-racist ideas from a national network of BIPOC designers into a single visual resource for anti-racist actions. Many of us never met in person, and because of the pandemic, and there are still some people I haven't met actually. And well, anyways, as a result, we had to put everything on Miraboard, or everything on the sort of online platform here, which is, this kind of this mess of well, not mess, but organized mess of various ideas. So almost every working Zoom call involved developing collective definitions of how anti-racism can be translated into action. These are like almost everything that we talked about. Many calls involved different groups of people due to the people's availability, different time zones, etc. We all came from different walks of life, and each time we met, our work and relationships were enriched by the collective and constructive conversations, which we hope to have some more of today. But let's see here. So working with vast amounts of data together online and asynchronously meant that a framework that embodied design justice and our collective values was essential to creating aligned and consistent work. As a visual thinker, I often found myself making diagrams, posting haphazardly to our Slack channel, saying, is this it? Is this what we mean? This is accurate. And I'm just trying my best. We're trying my best to think of what we collectively meant by liberation. So the diagram above is a product of one of those late nights, and perhaps one of the more accurate representations of the index. The intention of this index is to make anti-racism the industry norm, to put anti-racism into practice. And part of the reason why this diagram is so accurate is because it describes the cumulative nature of these anti-racist actions. I can't remember how many times I heard it was like, it can't be a checkbox. It's not just a checkbox, right? And so like, how do we visualize that? How do we make that clear? So you can start with one, which is what we encouraged, right? But the real impact comes from many and all at once. So we want to do together all this together all the time. And we call this a living tool because we want feedback. There's a kind of, the more that people are involved in this process, the more fruitful and more anti-racist we can become. We want to know if these actions are working and how you are interpreting the index, right? Is the translation working? What new resources have you found and what new structures of accountability have you come up with? Because the impact comes from both doing the anti-racist actions out in the world, but also in the internal reflection of the process. You know, those existential conversations you have with your friends, late night studio, that's part of it. So this internal and external work is what improves the translation from that Black Square post on social media intention, right, to the natural impact, which is collective liberation. Finally, no matter what the intentions, we'd like to share the last couple of stories on when not to translate, or when the limits of translation itself. Not translating is a matter of respect and can give people agency in the design process. The following project is actually about a game that I developed for my MLA thesis. Woo! So I designed this cooperative tabletop game as a tool for collaborative design that would also address common pitfalls in participatory design and community engagement practices. Now, I have to be honest, I was having a really hard time finding any joy in the work I was doing in grad school. I was frustrated by the problems of the world, and I was also frustrated by the problems in the design field, which was that communities had barely any control over what was designed in their own neighborhoods. And so I decided to address both of these issues through a pastime that I always enjoyed, and actually one that my mom didn't really like I was like me doing, but this is playing games. So in my thesis game called Relate, players are community members and decide on a project that they'd like to design together. For example, a community garden. The goal is to reach consensus on key design decisions by sharing and relating values and landscapes, expressing support for those values and landscapes, and specifying particular social, environmental, and material aspects of each design element. Within the medium of the game, anything can happen with the right rules and mechanics. I use the realm of the game, often called the magic circle in game studies, to explore how people could collectively shape their environment. For me, it had to be collective and it had to be cooperative because I was addressing public space, which is shared, and also because I'm a terribly sore loser. In the game design, there is a careful balancing act between the specificity and simplification to maximize each card's applicability within limited game components. Players inherently communicate through game pieces, translating their ideas and their thoughts into what is best shown on a given game component, like this card, for example. They can choose a landscape card, such as gathering space or path or water feature, and this imprecise language of the components actually allows for broader interpretation and encourages discussion amongst players to decide what is the most accurate to what they want and come up with a collective understanding of what gathering space means. So instead of me translating all the different possible ideas that can come up as a single game designer, it was more of in the process of playing the game, folks were translating and developing these together. Wild cards, to go even further, often serve as a fun boon or challenge in card games. And when I think of what brings that extra spark of joy when I play games, I think of customization. So in Relate, the wild card is a blank card that lets players add a landscape or value of their own. I realized there was no need for the game itself to translate all the possible interpretations or landscapes and values, but to provide a space, a space for translation. For the players to develop the most precise and accurate understanding, and in many cases, the most like culturally sensitive, in their very own specific context. So the playing of the game is what gives players the authorship over the work and the agency in determining the truth of that project. In fact, playing the game is the best way of testing this out, getting constructive feedback and revising the work. It's like getting to test a building while at full scale, while it's already built, and then being able to rebuild it and revise it at the same time. This is probably the most fun I had in making iterations, which I'm sure many of your professors ask you to make. But not only because I was learning about how to make the game better, it was also because I was learning about the people and the values of the people I was playing with. So this process models how I imagine the game to be played out in the world and how I imagine our future shared environments to be designed, with space for translation, designed and redesigned for community and by the community.
Ooh, I wish we had brought the game.
Oh, I should have.
All right, so throughout the lecture, we've emphasized processes and practices of translation from the Pacific that continue to travel onward and outward with, in our case, Chinese and broadly Pacific and Asian diasporas in our many migrations. And so one last story before we have a conversation of diasporic translation, starting with a set of phrases in Chinese that have permeated across the Pacific since our first encounters with Westerners. 丢脸, to lose face. 给面子, to give face. 保全面子, to save face. Even 要 or 不要脸, meaning to want or to not want face. There are at least a dozen other turns of phrase describing the demonstration of respect, deference, or the failure thereof. Even a line in Alice Wu's iconic queer Asian film, Saving Face, in which the father says to the daughter, 我这辈子的脸被你都丢光了. You have lost me my entire lifetime's worth of face. So dramatic. Last summer, I was at artist residency working on a body of work with this as the focal point in hopes of physically, culturally, and emotionally excavating experiences of shame, dysphoria, agency, and identity through a queer trans Chinese diasporic lens by literalizing these actions taken upon a face. Who really owns a face? Whose is it to lose? Where has it gone when lost? And by chance, this artist residency was a stone's throw away from the eastern terminus of the first transcontinental railroad in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And by chance, I had planned to drive along I-80 to my next engagement at the western terminus in San Francisco, Jiujingshan. I was traveling forwards on the colonizer trail to California, and yet meeting the ghosts of my ancestor cousins who had lived and worked and inevitably loved themselves and each other inland. And thus somehow I was going forwards and backwards at the same time. It occurred to me that I had not been losing my face in all these gestures, but perhaps giving it, meaning to show due respect for ancestor cousins of mine along the railway. Now, the faces aside, I was actually looking for more sites of extraction hidden in the archives when I stumbled across one word a dozen times, then a dozen more, and more again, Chinese, a word which looks and sounds nothing like our many words for ourselves, scrawled across maps made by an Anglo-American company to finesse capital out of fire risk. At site after site of 19th century extraction, I found traces of Chinese bodies exploited by US white settler infrastructures to dispossess indigenous peoples and lands and to suppress Black resistance and liberation. Which led me to 给面子, to give face, to Chinese diasporic informal architectures across the continental US, outside of all the major cities where we expect them. In some cases, there's one remaining building, or perhaps a reconstituted facsimile as a museum. In others, there is just one street sign, such as Plum Alley outside of a parking garage in Utah, or Ase Avenue, named for a Cantonese labor organizer in Wyoming. But in nearly all cases of rural Chinese diaspora in the US West, Chinatown was purposefully set on fire and burned to the ground, as in Reno, Nevada, where it was burned down at least twice, once by the Reno government. And in nearly all cases of Chinatown burned to the ground, I have been finding traces of us in the insurance maps they drew in case of fire. In engaging Sanborn insurance maps, which most often label Chinese structures as hazards, as seen on the right in the green highlight of Chinese-owned laundries in San Francisco, California, or San Rafael, California, this work of translation reconstitutes Chinese diasporic structures, or in truth, a phantom or a shadow of them, out of the technical details left by Anglo-American surveyors, 1 or 2 stories, stovepipes or terracotta or brick chimneys, composite or shingled roofs, firewalls, and so forth. There are virtually no other architectural documents of these Chinese settlements, and yet translating what is there only reveals the limits of translation in revealing what truths are not there. These architectural histories and presents reflect the calculus of white supremacist settler colonization in time and space. On the one hand, quote unquote, the Chinese must go. And on the other, as seen on the left, the US Federal Army was stationed in Rock Springs, Wyoming for 14 years following the 1885 Chinese massacre, where 28 Chinese men were brutally murdered, to prevent Chinese miners employed by the Union Pacific from escaping that racial violence. Back in Los Angeles, I worked with a Chinese-Canadian artist and bookmaker, Taylor Zanke, of Allowing Many Forms, to produce an artist book titled In Case of Fire, 万一火灾, which could attempt to make visible what is missing from the archives while giving face to the people who endured horrific violence and yet were more than those experiences. I was guided by brilliant thinkers and scholars, diasporic thinkers and scholars even, in sifting through archival photographs and my own photos to register narratives across time, following Sadia Hartman in her speculative history methodologies, and then in nestling my subjects and myself into moments of opacity, following Edouard Glissant's concept of le droit à l'opacité, or the right to opacity. In fact, I found that by directly using original source materials, rather than translating each archival and contemporary photograph into architectural drawing, I could register more than spaces across time. But in fact, I could register a Chinese diasporic gaze, mine, to both spaces and to other gazes across time. At most of these sites, I had a choice of whether or not to include violent images and texts, or whether or not certain translations ought not to be made. And other strategies might be 面子 instead, to properly see the lives lived in wholeness. And now lastly, I remember the day I found 3 words scrawled on a 1904 Sanborn map of Reno, Nevada, where the Chinatown had already been burned down once in 1878 and would be burned down again in 4 years from then. I cried when I read it. Chinese vegetable garden. I felt I needed to know who wrote those words. It was almost certainly a he, struck by its size that he felt he had to notate it, its abundance, its smells and sounds. Was he disgusted? Did he consider it a nuisance, a hazard? Did he see the gardeners as human? I don't know that we can know, but what I do know is that my tai tai, my po, my mama and my baba have also tended to generations of caiyuan, vegetable gardens. Diasporic translations of ourselves as seeds passed through hands and earth, seeds that my family members carried with them across the Pacific. So finally, to close, a note on practice.
Practice, 实践, 练习, 做法, 实习, 推行, 习惯, 习制. These are all different kinds of meanings of practice. It means we put into practice, we perform an exercise, an activity repeatedly in order to get a certain kind of proficiency. There's a way of, it could be a way of doing things, 做法. And it can even mean kind of something that in the context of the classroom, right? A sort of skills exercise, field work, to carry out, pursue a habit, a custom. I have a, my mom would always say, oh, or, I might have some not so good, not so good habits. But so how do we get into that a good sense of habit? We'd like to kind of open up or close, or rather open up the conversation with imagining what these practices could be. Thank you.
We have time for questions. I hope questions, comments, conversations, please.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. When do you not translate though? Because I feel like not translating leaves room for misinterpretation. Whoever is like doing your work. And then that kind of continues like this narrative of like where we are right now with pedagogy. So is not translating good? Like I don't know.
Yeah, great question. Could everyone hear it? Or I'm happy to take a stab at it, unless you have.
Yeah, well, and so my first thought is like, who's doing the translating?
Yeah.
Right, and what is being translated? Because I think this is also part of, like where the intent of the translation also matters. Because that really shapes the impact, right, that these translations or mistranslations could have. So,
Can I add to that? I was gonna say, if Kristen ended this slide on in a very nice place, following my Chinese parents, I would have said, you need to practice every day and we need to start right now. So I think that's how we find out. I love the question. Thank you for asking it. And I think I agree with what Kristen is saying. I think we tried to make the outline of the lecture actually a roadmap. So starting with accuracy and precision, like examining our tools, then examining our intentions and the impacts of those intentions, and then asking, okay, am I the right person to do this? Is this the right moment? Is this the right tool? Is this the right audience? Right. So when we say limits of translation, or in some cases, do not translate, we're not saying do not act, right? There might be a different action. So in some of the examples, Kristen's game, I would say what I learned from it is like, okay, you might create a space for translation because someone else might be the right person to do it. I think in my story, I was trying to say there might be like repeated instances, images of violence, like the stories of the Chinese on the railroad are all about how people were getting blown up and people were freezing in the winter, and most of the images that none of which I showed today are of bodies, like dead bodies. So I translated none of those, but I could speak to you about them, but there is a different way to tell the story, I would argue. Right. I think that really probably resonates across different communities, even though I was speaking for my own community. Those are the kinds of questions, like nuances or context, that I think you're probably dealing with in your work, I imagine. Does that start to answer the question? Yeah. Yes, please. No, we want to be more conversational.
Back to the graph. How would that model work in like public design spaces that still kind of like thrive and represent like a racist pedagogy? Like how would you say that like we should move forward? I know that you're saying a practice, but like what, like.
ooh, should we go back to that slide?
Can you repeat the question for the online?
Yeah, thank you. So the question is like, okay, there are, yes, okay, you just shared a lot of examples, but when we actually talk about the realm of public design, where we're like meeting a lot of racist barriers and institutions, how would you actually like put it into practice? Like not just, okay, we're gonna practice, but how do you put it into practice? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Restating? And then Kristen, looks like you had a thought.
Well, I think, yeah, I think it's hard because everyone is in a different kind of context, right? It's dependent on, you know, if you are a student or if you are someone in an academic institution, or if you are like a kind of leader or in an organization or something like that, there are different kind of steps you can take. And I think something that I've encountered a lot is that a lot of these processes and like what goes on in the background are really obscure. Like, you know, as a professor now at Pratt, like there's just, and after organizing a kind of a conference there, it's like realizing, wow, there's all these other systems and like politics in play. And so I guess to kind of think about how to actually go about, let's say, recruiting and hiring, right? Those processes can be made more transparent. And it's also part of, this is actually part of the practice of doing it, right? Like when you start trying to do it, it's like, oh, we know the thing that we want, and you start trying to do this, right? Maybe there are other ways to do it, because we're essentially asking folks to kind of do stuff that maybe that hasn't been done before, right? And so, and we kind of acknowledge that, right? Hence the sort of living tool, kind of living aspect of that, and the constant sort of feedback. So I don't know, is that kind of helpful?
Can I take a stab at it too?
Yeah.
Okay, I think, you know, one of the things that is not a takeaway from, you know, the series of slides where I showed, for instance, like all of these different types of maps, the takeaway is not, oh no, like, you know, of course they don't all make sense because now you've shown, you know, I've done some trick and I've shown how they all are like terrible. No, because they were created for really specific purposes and they fulfilled those purposes. So that's really what was being discussed there. And there's a scholar, Macarena Gomez-Barris, who talks about the extractive view. So these like satellite imagery or like GIS, like these tools that like big oil companies and big tech companies, you know, kind of use to surveil is the extractive view. And she talks about like deauthorizing the extractive view by revealing kind of like, well, in my words now, like the seams, like picking, that's what I'm usually trying to do in my drawing practice. I'm just trying to like pull, where is the thread? Like if I pull on it long enough, it's going to start to unravel. I think that it's like a thankless question if it's just about like, well, if there's so many barriers now, and this is not how the system as it is not how we actually want to practice, is not liberatory, is not this, not that. So do we work with it or do we not work with it? That's like a thankless question. Like we can ask it and it may make sense in certain contexts, but if that's where our inquiry ends, like we're just going to be frustrated. I think that for me, I wish for us to be a little agile and sort of like try to catch which view or which gaze is trying to accomplish which thing. And then try to see if we can move around those things towards our own ends. So for instance, I did not actually talk about my work as a project manager with the Los Angeles Land Trust in the content of the lecture, but in that work, we are interfacing with the city of LA, the county, the state, the LA Unified School District. We have an MOU with them to do school greening projects. Some of our projects are former oil sites in LA. One of them is very close to USC, actually, where I used to teach. Some of them are pocket parks. Some of them are like big arts campuses, right? And they're all, we're basically the developer for the public, we're the client representing the public. And the amount of bureaucracy that is in part of that work is immense. So, you know, it's like, I can't even count how many types of code switching is happening to like accomplish those questions. And I don't know that everyone would enjoy that. I bet you would be good at it, but it's more of a question of like, would you enjoy that or find that fulfilling, or would you want to like do other work in another part of the system. I'm sort of like projecting a little bit to like what I imagine is why you're asking the question. So that's why I sort of went in a little bit of a direction in that way. But yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm just kind of barely skimming the surface of like understanding. I feel like these ideas are very abstract, but I'm kind of tapping into them right now a little bit, and very cool. And kind of, I think piggybacking off of what Rondella and you guys are talking about, like, I mean, this is just a comment, like, it's just so frustrating being in a society where everything is so bad and awful, and these
Oh, yeah.
these banking insurance maps are actively screwing over us. They're actively oppressing everyone in society. And yeah, we want to translate the map and make a beautiful art project, and that can communicate this information to people. But also, it's just like, I want to burn up the maps and I want to tear it all down. So it's just very frustrating, like kind of these two ways of approaching it, like inside. I don't know. It's frustrating.
Can I restate quickly for the Zoom? It's extremely frustrating to exist in a society that is like actively detrimental to human life. And like, maybe like actually kind of want to burn the drawings instead of make a project out of it. Totally agree. Totally agree. Yes. Okay.
I mean, question here, you're kind of going into the education of architecture, maybe art education and design, in a sense of more humanity or maybe empathetical direction. That makes me question, how do you even implement this or even navigate yourself in professional practice, especially as someone who's going into it immediately. It's like, I kind of have to take on these conditions. How do I take more of this into there? What's maybe those first baby steps, and maybe like eventually making my own web law.
If I could add something also kind of referring back to some previous questions, is like, in terms of like how to go about this, right? I would say if you are going about anything, go about it together, right? With people that you trust, that you care about. And earlier in the presentation, right, we kind of talked a little bit about how the impact is also on ourselves in doing the work, in having the conversations. So like, if you don't know how to do something, or if it's hard to do something, right? Like, talk to someone about it, right? Come talk to us at that, you know, like, there's also actually even in the newspaper, right? There's actually a whole page or spread of case studies actually that talk about sort of doing the work, in the sense of like, oh, how has this work been done already, or has been, you know, started at least.
I guess I'll just add to that while we're on this diagram that like, there is no version where you can be all the dots in this diagram. So like, everyone give yourself permission to not, you know, like, don't hold yourself to that standard. And so like, when I hear, yeah, like if you're in a position where you're a recent grad and you go into practice, you want to log hours, you want to do this, you want to just have health insurance, you just want to have a paycheck, get it, you know. I don't think anyone is like, why did you not make all the dots like happen on the diagram? You know, and I don't think you should put that pressure on yourself either. I don't think that would be more productive. I think that would be less productive, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to sort of be kind to yourself. Yeah, I think I saw it over here, actually, next.
Thank you both so much. Kristen, it's great to see you. It's a wonderful talk. I noticed something. I don't know where I'm trying to formulate the question, but I think this, I'm really intrigued and fascinated by the work that you did with Sandler maps. And I think what struck me is that the fact that those maps were made by the oppressors themselves, they actually revealed the history of something that had been erased. So I'm fascinated by this. Yeah. It reminds me of what we've been seeing with the recent scholarship around Seneca Village,
yeah.
Where the documents of those who own property there claiming their dollar amounts on their property are the only ways we know people who were otherwise erased. So it's actually the systems of mapping, the systems of land grabbing and exploitation that have actually given us an archive that we're able to mine today to see what otherwise would have been completely lost. So I guess my question is a little bit about like how, you know, we shouldn't burn those maps, I would argue, despite the kind of intent behind it, actually given us a gift to be able to find that vegetable garden, which otherwise might not have been known. So I'm curious, like, how do you find other kinds of archives, or how might we be archiving today that would be a different, that would allow us to find histories that may have been lost, or how do we start to record histories that might otherwise not be remembered in 100 years?
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I don't even know if I can like summarize as well as you articulated that. But thinking about some of these archives that exist being, really being the place that we can still find these traces today, with Seneca Village as an example in New York. What does that mean? Like, how do we approach archiving, and how do we like deal with archives? I think it goes back to initially like who's doing the archiving, because it's a pretty violent process depending on who's doing it. So there are a lot of, like, for instance, like oral history projects, across communities in obviously our country, but across the world, where it's incredibly important that the people doing that that work are like from the community. So like I would very much ask myself that question of like, am I the right person to do this? Like almost first. But that is, so like that aside, I feel like really heartened actually by this. I know it's frustrating and it's like depressing to like think about all this stuff, but it actually, for me, it's like going deeper into it helps me get closer to an understanding, like a conviction or like a confidence in like seeing that I otherwise wouldn't have. A lot of Chinese American history, just as an example, is incredibly uncomfortable for me. Because we were brought, we're really complicit in a lot of different parts of the like machinations of this country. Lisa Lowe, the historian I mentioned, who wrote this incredible book called The Intimacies of Four Continents, she looked in the archives of the British like Navy and all of these like naval officer letters and correspondences, and like there's literally a letter after the Haitian Revolution in 1804, I believe, where one British officer is writing to another British officer saying, we need to find a different like colored labor source. Could it be Chinese? And then you start seeing Chinese people getting brought over, dragged across the ocean to the Caribbean, and ultimately to the continental US as well. So that is an entanglement there. The railroad, I actually did not want to research for a long time growing up, because two reasons. One is my family has a different migration story. I'm not descended from somebody who worked on the railroad. So I felt like, am I allowed to? And sort of had to find my own way to it. And then secondly, even though my experience as a racialized person in the US is completely descended from the way that those people were treated and received. So it's actually, that's how I close the loop, just for anyone who's interested. But the other reason is because we were brought here to build the settler infrastructure to displace and dispossess and commit genocide against indigenous nations. So why are we, there are other histories that we can come up with all sorts of examples, but I'll just speak to my own at this moment, but it's completely horrifying. So it's how do we even speak about the violences that were committed against these laborers when they themselves were complicit in an even larger scale of violence that was being committed at the same time. So first of all, I just zoomed out a lot without really answering your question, but I think what I'm trying to say is we have to start engaging with these archives more. And it just feels like somebody, and by somebody, I mean this is the systems that we live in, has scattered all the puzzle pieces and told, this is not original thought from me, but area studies or different departments where it's oh, you have to look at Chinese people here and you have to look at other people here. There are, we want those, yes, on record. I want those spaces. At the same time, we need to make sure that we are putting the pieces together from the different archives. So I don't have maybe one day someone will pay me to write a class where we can just do this all the time. I want that. But right now I'm just I just feel really compelled to start and like find other people. Sounds like I found a bunch of people in this room, who will work with me on that.
And yeah, I mean, also kind of just to share a little bit of thoughts on, I mean, it's interesting that you share kind of like how you started researching this, because like I also have a different migration story, and actually that's part of the reason why also I haven't necessarily been talking about this. But in terms of archiving, like some of these like feelings of these archives, right, is that like, yeah, actually maybe they shouldn't have existed in the first place, right? Because what really should have been the archive was me still remembering how to speak Chinese, or was, any number of examples, still remembering the stories of their families, right? So, but in the context of today, like if we just bring it to this room, I think it's important that like we share these, we start thinking about what is valuable enough to archive, right? And like what is archived and what could be archived, and kind of even in the space of the classroom, really, right? Especially, and making potentially part of the curriculum, like actually, I really love the house history design, because because I learned so much about myself and where I'm coming from and why my mom made the apartments the way they are, right? And so it's like maybe something about that, where students are finding their own stories and archiving those stories for themselves, so that they can pass down, oh yeah, like I didn't know, okay, just one thing about the intro, if I can share quickly, right? Guangxi Guilin is where so in China, there are these different, I'm forgetting the terms, okay, but like there's a term where there's a form where you fill out, and my mom would fill out like, I think it was Guan, which is like where your ancestors are from. And so she put Guangxi Guilin, and as ethnicity, she put Hui, which is a Chinese Muslim kind of like minority within China. And so this was news to me. Like I was like, oh, there's a place where you actually said where our ancestors are from, because I never really knew. I was like, oh, I'm from Beijing, like, right? And so kind of being able to look into those histories and offering that opportunity within the space of learning to kind of find those stories about yourself, I think is also a really wonderful way of kind of archiving the stories we have like today. So, and
I was just gonna add, I think in the span of this great talk, you two both give some interesting clues to kind of creative forms of scholarship that begin to recover a kind of subjectivity that's latent in these so-called like violent archives or whatnot. So I think even back to your comment, like wrestling with the sort of beautiful art project that's sort of situated in your experience, bringing up creative authors, historians like Sciame Lecture are these kind of ways that I think we're sort of working through how to kind of recover a subjectivity when there really isn't one, or it's kind of exhibited through the lens of sort of violence or oppression. So I think that your talk really is doing some interesting work to kind of bridge those gaps. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have one more question.
Sure.
I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
How would we impose like core ethical studies of architecture as opposed to, like graduating, like being introduced in the work field and like feeling empathy within our design, and like we don't really understand how people occupy spaces, although we create these spaces for people to occupy. So like even in academia, like I feel like a lot of our work, although it's like very conceptual, we're not really thinking about how it impacts people. So should like our core studio or the system of architecture change where we're now incorporating more like ethical or trying to find that.
I have a thought.
take away.
Okay, and I'll to restate a little bit, and yeah, there's such a good question. there's such a like disjointedness between what we teach in architectural education and what then students graduate into practice. And there's also a little bit of ambiguity. I think I'm hearing in your question too. It's like, it's not like architecture school is bad and practice has got it right somehow, or the flip of it either. It's like, it's just that they're not continuous, and what kinds of things should change within the core studio or within the curriculum broadly. I mean, this is one of the things that Yale just stepped out, but like Jerome, you know, like people were like, and you know, we were trying to do this, like the Lisbon exhibition that you worked on was also like, you know, again, it wasn't really so academic, but it was sort of also trying to explode out certain things, you know, so, but I digress on that. My thought is, like, I don't think we're gonna make a class and be like, we did it. I think that's like why we wanted to talk about the foundations of design justice class, is every single time it's been taught, you talk to anybody who worked on it and they're just like, yeah, but it could have been better if it's this isn't this, you know, or like in one way it worked really well, but you know, or oh, but if we taught it somewhere else, it'd have to change, you know, like it's so I'm not sure, because the students will change too. I didn't, you know, I talked a little bit more on the educator side because that's what we could speak to, but you know, I had the pleasure of teaching foundations of design justice twice or sort of 3 times, but twice at the same school, University at Buffalo, and it was extremely different each time. As any studio professor knows, your class changes every time because of your students, even if you're the same person, right? So what should happen for core studio? Okay, this might be a little not what you want to hear. Okay. Jerome is laughing at me. I'll give us a brief anecdote. What I really wanted to, I hated architecture school, I apologize, but I think everyone knows this about me. And for my Master of Architecture thesis, I really wanted to like do something that wasn't theoretical, that was really grounded. My penultimate year, I started like talking to people I was organizing with in the Bay Area and being like, could this be like, you know, could we make this like a big community project? And people have done that successfully. Okay, I ended up not doing it successfully, and then pivoting and going extremely theoretical because for a specific reason that I think is another option, which is I asked myself, what are things I can think about or do in school that I won't have time or energy to do later? Or what are things I can get away with? Or what's the type of drawing I can make that no one will ever pay me to make again? You know, and that's when I started making the weird stuff that I showed you today. And then I've been able to carry that on outside of school, outside of my day job. No one pays me to do it still, but you know, and so it sort of, that was the defining question for me as a student was like what in particular could I do in this situation, right? So I basically de-escalated it from what does this mean about me as a person or as a designer, and I just said, what should I do in this situation? And that would be like, again, I'm sort of like trying to speak to the question and speak to like, we're here with a lot of students, and I think Christin and I like shout out to the faculty, but we really want to talk to students, you know, so it's like, I think we're right. I know, no. Right, so I think I wanted to say that at some point, and like you gave me the question to say that. Okay, but what should happen with Core Studio? I'll just say as well, like, you know, it's gonna be this is like what like a lot of us in DMU and DAP are working on. Like it needs to be in partnership with practice. You can't know, but everybody's been doing this long before I became, you know, was in this discipline. I'm relatively new compared to how long people have been working on these problems. They're not new, you know, and everybody get sort of at a certain point kind of is left pointing a finger, and it's a Spider-Man meme, you know, it's like, who needs to change first? The core studio needs to change first. No, no, you need to like have better requirements. Yeah, yeah, the NAB requirements need to change, licensure needs to change. You need to like raise the wage, you know, the entering job, you know, all of the, actually, it's like all of the things need to happen. So it's hard. Yeah. So anyway, we could talk more about zoom into the core studio part. I just wanted to like share how I think through that.
I do think that we need to say that this has been a wonderful conversation and it's now almost quarter.
Oh, we gotta go.
And
Yeah.
I think folks need to get home. So,
Yes.
but we will continue the conversation. Next week, our turn in, who's coming next week? I'm sorry, I have my birthday.
Please hold on. Next week. Okay. Any students who want a staff newspaper? Thank you. Hey.